Alec Levenson is an economist and senior research scientist at the Center for Effective Organizations at the University of Southern California. He has trained business professionals from a large number of Fortune 500 companies in HR analytics, and he has recently published a widely acclaimed book titled Strategic Analytics: Advancing Strategy Execution and Organizational Effectiveness. In this interview, Alec will talk about his approach to HR analytics and the things that practitioners should keep in mind when they get started with HR analytics. In addition, Alec shows how, as an HR analytics professional, you can really add value to the organization as a whole. Hi, Alec. In your book, you talk about the problems that organizations experience in the way they conduct HR analytics. Can you elaborate on this?
So one of the problems is that the vast majority of HR analytics that take place today start with the data that you have at hand. Now, this may sound kind of bizarre because if you don't have any data, how can you do analytics? But there are some very traditional analytics that organizations do over and over and over again, but don't necessarily have a lot of strategic contribution. So for example, turnover reports are one of the most notorious. It seems like a natural thing to want to monitor turnover. And certainly if turnover is really high, we want to know if we're able to get it down. But creating a turnover report oftentimes creates the demand for action where there may not be any needed whatsoever. So people will take a look at it, you give it to your line leaders, and then they dig into it and they ask all kinds of questions about, why is this happening? Why is that happening? What's the trend? And it can create lots of activity, but without ever addressing the question of, is turnover even a question to worry about? So that's the first example. Now, even starting there, let's say that you do have a job or a part of the organization where turnover is a big issue. Now, a good example is call center representatives. So we know that call center reps, CSRs, oftentimes have very high turnover, but you need a context. So if I told you that there was 40% turnover, and you then came back and said, and we're talking about nuclear engineers, the people who are running the actual nuclear power plants, I'd be very concerned with 40% turnover. 40% turnover in a call center is actually sometimes really low. And so you actually need that context. Now, there are some kinds of call center jobs where 40% turnover would be really high. If I have people who are working as wealth managers for high net worth individuals in a bank. So these are the people serving the clients who've got the most assets that are being invested. Those people's jobs on the surface of it look a little bit like call center jobs, but of course they're radically different than people who are doing like outbound telemarketing or fielding technical questions about software products. Yeah. It's all about context. And so no matter what the data is, you have to look at the context first. You have to say, what are the key business issues that we're facing here? Figure out those questions. So what are the most important questions to ask first? Then what's the data you need to answer those questions? Sometimes that data will be sitting in your systems right now, but lots of other times it's not. And so you actually have to go out and get it. So that's my general critique, is that when you talk about HR analytics to start, it starts too often with the data you have at hand. And look, I can say this because I am a social scientist and I've spent my career playing around in data. But it's one of the things that we tend to get taught in graduate school, which is that analysis without context or looking at correlation without understanding causation can oftentimes lead you down dead ends and rabbit holes where you're better off oftentimes leaving the data alone, taking a step back, asking what are the most important issues here, and then figuring out how to go tackle them. And that's not what happens with a lot of HR analytics today.
Yeah, so how do you identify the most important issues?
Well, you really need to start with what is the strategy of the organization? What are you trying to accomplish? One of the reasons why I wrote my book, Strategic Analytics, is because I found myself over and over and over again, first of all, doing this work in companies. So the advice that I have to give doesn't come from me sitting inside my academic ivory tower, thinking some things up and then throwing them over for people to try to use in organizations. I'm actually out there every day working with companies on helping to solve fairly large challenges around motivation, productivity, teamwork, alignment, matrix design, the whole global operations, go-to-market systems, innovation. Those are the kinds of questions that companies struggle with every day. And what I'm providing as advice is the same thing that I do for myself. So I'm actually trying to get people to practice what I preach. Getting people, I'm trying to preach what I want people to practice, which is what I do, which is to go in and figure out what are the key issues that are at stake. One of the most challenging things is that you can, as an HR analyst, have a stakeholder who comes to you and says, give me some data on X because we need to we need to figure this out. We need to get deeper into it. So it could be about learning. It could be, like how quickly are people getting up to speed on the job. It could be about turnover. It could be about motivation and productivity, like how engaged are my employees. And it can be very, very enticing to want to go and just give them whatever they ask for. But a lot of times, even the stakeholders aren't necessarily framing things the right way in terms of what are the actual big issues at stake here. And I find that it is incredibly important to start there. So you start with what are the actual strategic issues you're facing? What are the real issues that need to be addressed? And then you move on from there. So that's the advice in the book. It's the advice. That's what I do when I'm teaching people how to do this, and it's what I'm trying to get people to do more themselves, which is to take that pause, ask about the strategic context, and then oftentimes, so this is the interesting thing. When we think about HR analytics, people usually go to thinking about number crunching, and they think about statistics. You think about the kinds of things you can do in Excel or do in a stats program or some of these some of these new software packages that the vendors are offering, or you can do data visualization. There's lots of different things you can do with data, but there's a lot of times the questions that we have come down to things like, have we actually articulated the roles and responsibilities correctly here? So if a group is not accomplishing its objectives, that could happen because we don't have good alignment in the group. We don't have good leadership. We aren't actually making it clear to people what they're supposed to be doing. We don't provide them the resources they need. The performance management system doesn't work very well. We're not holding people accountable. The information to do that kind of diagnostic most of the time is not sitting in the data that you have at hand. It's usually sitting out there with the people, and you have to go out there, talk to the leaders, talk to the people who are working inside that group, inside that part of the organization, find out what's really going on, and that's really the first step of the analytics. This is now, if this sounds like more like traditional organization development and not like HR analytics, you would be correct. And that's on purpose. And it's because really good analytics is actually a combination of being able to do that kind of OD assessment and couple that with, where needed, solid statistics and analysis of data. But the two of them together provide the whole picture that you need to do the right diagnosis of the system.
Yeah, so instead of saying go talk to the major stakeholders and see what keeps them up at night, you say do that, but also talk to the organization and explore the issues in the organization itself.
Exactly. And so so even if someone comes to you and says our problem is turnover, I would never take that at face value. I would then say, okay, great. So you see turnover as an issue. Why? Right? How is turnover actually impacting your ability to get the work done? And then that leads you to a much deeper level of understanding. So it could be that they feel like you're actually not able to keep people once you bring them in. So if you're able to attract people who are the top performers but not able to keep them long enough, that's an important piece of information. It could be that the rate of turnover is okay, meaning that in principle things could work well, but you're actually not getting good knowledge management and handoff so that as somebody leaves, you're able to seamlessly transition the work without having big hiccups that happen. Depending on why turnover might be the problem that your stakeholder is identifying, there's different kinds of impacts that the turnover has on your ability to be able to deliver the goods and services to your customers, and what that turnover means for the team to be able to do its work well and be able to actually perform better. So that diagnosis, you can't get it just from the conversation with a person telling you, oh, turnover is a problem. You also can't get it by just going to look at the turnover data. And even if you have, say, an employee survey, pretty good engagement data, those are always places to start so you can understand some of the context, but you can't actually do the full diagnosis without going and engaging with the people doing the work, doing kind of standard stakeholder interviews, participant interviews, understanding what's actually driving people's behavior there. And then If you want to, for example, oftentimes there might be need for doing a survey, but you want to do a survey only after you've done that engagement first, where you go in and you have the interviews, figure out what the context is, so you're then actually designing the right survey questions.
How do you leverage analytics to achieve superior organizational performance? So how do you really use analytics to drive organizational performance?
Got it. So you need to be, first of all, doing what I'd call more of a systems diagnosis. So I actually talk about 3 steps as in the process. The first step is you need to understand the business context extremely well. This means you actually need to be able to understand, how do you make money? I call this step the competitive advantage analysis. There isn't really much analysis involved, but you need to understand what actually creates your competitive advantage. So if you are a consumer products company like Unilever, Nestle, Pepsi, General Mills, the way that they create competitive advantage is through 2 primary means. It's through branding, and it's through their go-to-market systems. So all of the money they're able to create, the margins they're able to produce that give the results that their shareholders are happy with, come from those 2 main things. If you're talking about pharmaceutical companies, branded pharmaceutical companies like GlaxoSmithKline, Novo Nordisk, all of them, those companies get their competitive advantage through innovation, through mergers and acquisitions, and also through marketing. So every single company has the way that it creates competitive advantage, and it's important to start there. Because if, for example, somebody comes and they says, well, we've got a problem with engagement of people in this part of the organization. If they tell me that you've got problems with people who are with employee engagement in your manufacturing operations, for example, manufacturing operations where the product is produced for a consumer products company like a Nestle, Unilever, it's relevant. So certainly if things are going poorly there, then we want to make sure we can improve them. But you don't need to have world-class manufacturing for consumer products, whereas you do need it for a company like Intel or AMD, Samsung, when they're producing products that require extremely controlled environments, where even like the slightest little bit of dirt that gets introduced into the environment can ruin an entire product line. So this is the kind of analysis you want to be thinking about, which is, where do you actually get your strengths from? Where is it that you get the ability to be able to be ahead of, or at least keep pace with your competitors, and those parts of the organization. So in the case of pharmaceuticals, I want to be and pharmaceuticals is another example. So compared to consumer products, pharmaceuticals manufacturing also needs to be very closely controlled because of the issue about you could actually hurt patients if you run into problems with the manufacturing process. Those kinds of controls are much more important for those technology companies and pharmaceuticals than it is for consumer products. I mean, of course, you have to have the right controls in manufacturing consumer products, because then you could have products spoiling. You could potentially hurt people by sending things through that turn bad before the expiration date. But the negative consequences, the negative downside consequences there are not as big in terms of the business risk as they are for the semiconductor manufacturers and as they are for the pharmaceutical manufacturers. And you do the same kind of thing, going all the way through. So there's around branding, that's much more important for some types of industries than others. Generic pharmaceuticals is a big contrast to branded pharmaceuticals, where they look a lot more like regular consumer products. They don't rely on branding. They make all their money on small margins on what they produce and on the distribution. So that's where you always that's what you want to keep in mind, because when a stakeholder comes to you and they're an important person in the organization, they're a VP, an SVP, a general manager. Not all SVPs, not all general managers are created equal in terms of competitive advantage. Right? If they are running the manufacturing operations in a consumer products company, they're not as important as the people running the go-to-market system, the selling organization, and the people doing the marketing. It's just a reality of what the contribution of the business is, and that has direct implications for how much we can afford to invest in people there, what the organization is going to be willing to do in terms of making changes to be able to get improvements in performance. And that context is what you always need to start with to figure out, first of all, where does the organization need the most help in being able to execute its strategy, and also what kinds of resources you're going to be able to bring to the table, and is it worth getting into those issues?
Yeah, so that's the system diagnosis you talk about. What's then the next step?
Okay, so the first step is understanding that the whole system, which is how you make money. The second step is to then look at the actual work unit that you're talking about. So if we're talking about a manufacturing operation, then we want to look at the plants. If we're talking about sales and distribution, we want to look at the sales teams. We want to look at the go-to-market teams, the people that actually take the product from where it's being produced to being out with the retailers or into your distribution channels. That you look at that system, whether it's a work group, a site, a function, whatever it is. And you then want to look at that entire group that's there, that entire system, to say, where are things working well or not? Thinking back again to the kind of typical OD work, if someone comes to you and says we have a work group where things aren't going well, we've got the sales team where they're just not meeting their performance objectives, you want to take a holistic look at everything that's going on in that group. Now, this is not a fishing expedition. Right? I'm not saying that you should take 6 months and look at every single thing possible and then come back with an answer, but you do need to go in, talk to the leaders, talk to the kind of key stakeholders in other parts of the organization that work with that group, talk to the people in the group to understand what are the performance metrics they're trying to accomplish, where are things going well and where aren't they going well, and to hear from them first and foremost what they think the issues are. That's a systems diagnostic, is to cast a very broad net, understand where things are going well and where they're not. Now, doing those stakeholder interviews, doing those interviews of people who are in the system and actually working in it, very often will tell you everything you need to know in terms of a diagnostic. So I do this over and over and over again. When I'm working with a company where they say we've got issues around things like speed of decision making, or we can't get alignment between people in different functions, our global operations are not working the way we want them to. Answering those questions rarely means having to go down to the level of the kinds of data that we use in HR analytics. So the data that are typically used in HR analytics are things around, how many people do we have? How much are they getting paid? What kinds of roles are they playing? We oftentimes have, engagement data from a survey. Those are all interesting and important, but only if you need to look at those differences among people. A lot of times, the answers to the questions lie at one level higher up from that, a higher level of aggregation, which is the work unit or the business unit, the function. And those diagnostics are done through interviews. You can oftentimes figure out, where is it that we don't have alignment amongst people in the organization? Where is it that leaders aren't cooperating with each other? And the best information on that, the best diagnostic you can do, comes from those conversations. It doesn't come from fielding a survey where you send it out to 1,000 people and you ask them to rate leadership behaviors. Because those kinds of measurements, those are generic measurements, but they don't tell you anything about the details of the context. And it's the details of the context you just start with first and foremost. So you start with the competitive advantage analytics first. It's at a very high level. How do we make money? How do we go to market? Then you go down a level to what's the part of the organization where the issue exists. Do your diagnosis there. Oftentimes that's enough, and you can get the answers you need just from that diagnostic. Sometimes, though, it's not enough, and then you want to go down a level to what we call the traditional HR analytics, and you do that in situations where you know that the problems lie within a particular set of jobs or part of the work process. So if it's the actual sales that are taking place, how your salespeople are interacting with your customers, whether it's B2B or B2C, if it's around your customer support, like the customer service representatives and the kinds of experiences your customers are having, if it's around marketing, right? So we have some marketing that's being done really well, other marketing is not being done really well. If that's the level at which the problems are occurring, which is among people working within a work group, so you've got kind of wide variation of performance, and you know that that's where a lot of the problems are coming from, In that kind of situation, we can then do what I call the traditional HR analytics, which is looking at differences across people. What drives differences in motivation? What kinds of skills do they bring to the table? What kinds of relationships do they have with their manager? Are their goals being set appropriately? Are they being performance managed well? That's the kind of traditional HR analytics. But the reason why you don't want to start there, and you want to start with, as I said, the competitive advantage analytics, then down to the kind of the work group or the enterprise, and finally end with the individual. The reason why you don't want to start with the individual is because the following. If you look around the organization and you say, do we have issues that need to be addressed? The answer is, oh my goodness, we do, and they're everywhere. Okay? There is no manager who gets promoted from being an independent contributor, frontline worker, to being a first-line supervisor who is able to be perfect out of the gate. In fact, many of them are very imperfect years after being in the job. So if we look at a particular work group and we say we've got these salespeople, we've got these technicians where things aren't going very well, they're not performing entirely up to how we want them to. They're disaffected. They feel like they're not very connected to the organization. Whatever the diagnosis is that's out there, okay? We can find those problems everywhere. And so there literally are today, even if your organization is only a few hundred people in it, I could find probably 67 things to do tomorrow to be able to fix. And if you've got a 1,000 person organization, it's going to be like 670. And if it's a 10,000 person organization, there are thousands of things that we can fix, literally. So if your goal is to find something that isn't going well and go fix it, then you can take the typical kind of HR analytics approach, which is where do we see problems and let's go solve them. But if you do that, you could spend a lot of time focusing on things that can be important for the people in those roles. And I don't want to diminish this. I mean, if there are people who are really having a difficult time in their jobs where there's an ability to improve things for them, then absolutely we should do that if we can. And analytics can be very helpful for doing that. But if we're talking about prioritizing, how can we have the biggest impact on the company so that they can actually improve its performance? And at the end of the day, if you're able to do that on some really big issues, that also then gives you the leeway to be able to, in the future, define more of what you want to do for yourself. So you may have a group of people who aren't very strategically important for the business, but there's still we care about them because we want them to be treated well. If the business doesn't think that they're that important in terms of strategic priority, and you can help the business out by helping to address some of these key barriers where they're really struggling, that's going to give you a lot. That's going to open it up so you can say, I want to do both. I want to be able to focus on these this part of the organization that you might not think is extremely important, but this is part of what I'm doing as a professional. If you start with the people who are not viewed as being extremely important and you don't address the strategic issues, there's a much greater chance that you're going to have your budget's going to be impacted. You might have resources taken away from you. If somebody leaves and you're in a cost-cutting situation, they might not let you replace that person. So focusing on the strategic issues of the business is also an important strategy for even being effective as a professional working in HR analytics, so you can make sure that you can have the stature, you can have the influence, so you can address as many issues as you want.
Yeah, because one of the challenges that HR traditionally had is that it found it hard to show the value that it added. Same for HR analytics and HR analysts, they find it hard they struggle to show the value that they add to the rest of the organization. Does the approach you describe fix this problem?
Oh, it can do a lot towards fixing it. And let me take, for example, typical kind of HR process. So it is very common for HR leaders to turn to the HR analytics people and say, use your analytics to prove to me what we should be doing in HR, or to show me how we can improve what we're doing in HR. And that's a noble thing to do, but you have to be very careful about where you focus your attention. So a lot of what we do around performance management, around learning and development, I mean, pretty much all the HR processes, a lot of what we do is not directly related to improving business performance. It's designed to help the business, and it can contribute to improving business performance. But a lot of what happens in HR is important for kind of record keeping, for making sure people get paid, all the things that are important for keeping the lights on, okay, which is important tasks. But usually are not the best tools for being able to solve the big strategic problems the organization has, and that is what then causes HR to be diminished in stature and importance. Because when it comes to solving those big business issues, HR doesn't have anything to bring to the table, particularly if you're talking about your traditional HR tools. So that's the reason. So that's another reason why you want to think about taking the analytics and to use. I mean, Dave Ulrich has this phrase, which is you want to be looking outside in as opposed to inside out. The traditional HR does too much navel gazing, too much looking at its own belly button by saying, what are we doing in HR and how can we incrementally improve what we're doing in HR? That's a very different question than saying, what does the business need and how can HR help? The answer often means bringing to the table traditional kinds of HR solutions. So whether it's around recruiting or compensation or development, those can be strategic, but you need to figure out first what the business issues are that need to be addressed, and then what's the HR solution that can be applied to it. And you can use the analytics to both identify what the solution should be, and as well as after you've gone in to help as HR, evaluate after the fact if you've actually made any improvements.
At the end of your book, you write, and I quote, "You can't scorecard your way to success unless analytics leads the way." And I presume you mean the HR scorecard. What do you mean with this sentence?
Well, it's exactly related to what I was just saying. So much of what we have in HR are HR processes that are designed for the purposes of monitoring people, seeing what they're doing, counting how many people we have. Those kinds of statistics sometimes can be insightful, but oftentimes they don't add a lot of value in terms of us understanding what's actually driving the business. Do we want to know how many people we have? Of course. Is it important to know what spans of control are? Perhaps. Do we want to know how people are paid relative to benchmark compensation outside? Yes, it can be useful. But in each of these cases, there isn't necessarily an argument for following those metrics as the way to manage the business, unless you first take a look at what are the key drivers that enable the business to succeed, and then figure out what are the HR metrics that you can use to support it. So for example, in work that I did with a consumer products company a number of years ago, they were working with people in their go-to-market function. So this was the people who take the product, from the distribution centers, bring it out into the retailers, and get in the grocery stores. In that instance, having people who could make a compelling argument to a grocery store manager about why you should be giving additional shelf space to their products was a key part of how that company succeeded. And it turned out that knowing how much experience people had in sales before they came to work for the company actually was a pretty good predictor of how well they did in the job. What was interesting is that it actually predicted performance not just in the first 6 months in the job, but even many years into working there. So that said, there were two important things that were learned from looking at that metric and how it fit into the overall equation of how they achieved their performance. One is that measure of sales experience was actually an important strategic metric, as opposed to lots of other things they knew about their salespeople that were informative but weren't actionable in terms of saying if we focus on this particular metric, we'll be able to improve performance. And in that particular case, the amount of prior sales experience was something that they could say, we could look at this, and if we can actually bring in people who have more sales experience, certainly compared to bringing in people who have no sales experience, they could expect that their salespeople would then actually perform better in the job. So that's the sense in which it was strategic. But it also was very helpful because if you think about it, a lot of the sales skills that are needed in, for like arguing that you should, be able to sell more of a particular product, there's a certain kind of level of aptitude needed for that, but this isn't like you're going and making pitches to Wall Street investors about highly complex products and having to have PhD level competencies to be able to explain why the variance in something or the beta for a particular investment product is something important. We're talking about relatively simple sales skills that a lot of people in principle should have. in which the company assumed people were learning either through their training programs or they were learning on the job. And what the analysis told them was, despite the fact that they're actually this is a very successful company. So despite the fact that they were very successful in sales, they knew what they needed to be doing, and they knew the kinds of things to tell people to do, and they also knew that people were learning on the job. Despite that, despite them being fairly mature in their sales processes and their training and development and their screening, people who came in with more sales experience beforehand still were outperforming people who didn't come in, and even after they got the training, got the learning on the job, got the feedback and the coaching. So what that said is that there was an imperfection in the company's own development systems that said that they should be focusing more on bringing people in who had the prior sales experience.
Thank you very much, Alec. That was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.